Thank you so much, Vitaly, and thank you for having me, and thank you to the rest of the Smashing crew too. I watched a little bit of Ben and Adekunle's talks in between doing my kind of frantic pre-Christmas debugging and fixing as many tickets as I could, because today is our last day at work before the Christmas break. So I'm really looking forward to catching up with those videos later on. My name's Michelle, as you already know. I'm lead front-end developer at Atomic Smash, a web agency in Bristol in the UK. We mostly specialise in WordPress development. I'm very much on the front-end side, HTML, CSS and JavaScript. We're actually hiring for a WordPress support developer at the moment, so do get in touch if that's you and you're interested in working with us. So today I want to talk about custom properties. As I mentioned, they are among my favorite things in CSS. And I spend a lot of time in CodePen making demos just for fun. And I'm finding new ways to use custom properties all the time. I find they make writing CSS so much more fun and easier too. So I want to share some of those use cases with you today. So you may have heard of custom properties referred to as CSS variables, because they allow you to store values for reuse in your style sheets. So if you're not too familiar with the syntax, here's a quick recap for you. So here I'm defining a custom property called primary color on the root element. So that's the equivalent to the HTML element, but with higher specificity. And the value of our custom property is deep pink, the CSS named color. So that makes it a global variable that we can use anywhere in our style sheet. And then we can use that custom property in a selector to apply our predefined value to the background color of this square, say, or anywhere else you might want to use that color property. So you could use it for the color, border color, or whatever you want. And we can also provide a default value. So in case there's a possibility that we're using the custom property before it's being defined. So if we've previously defined our custom property, which we have here on the root element, then our box is going to be deep pink. But if we haven't defined it yet, then it's going to fall back to dark orchid as the background color. Browsers that don't support custom properties won't recognize that background color as a valid property value. So one way we could handle that is to set the background color value elsewhere in our selector and allow the browser to ignore the second rule if it doesn't support it. So in IE 11, which doesn't support custom properties, our box is going to be deep pink. But if we don't include a fallback value and the browser doesn't support custom properties, the background color will fall back to its initial value, which is transparent. So the default value in the custom property is meaningless if the browser doesn't understand it, which maybe goes without saying. However, if you have a nice, lovely browser like Chrome or Firefox, or basically any modern browser these days, and that browser does support custom properties, and you put some kind of nonsensical value in there, like 300, which makes absolutely no sense as a background color value, then it will also fall back to the initial value, even though we've set the background color somewhere else in the selector. So again, our element will be transparent. So that's just something to watch out for. And of course, we've been able to use variables for quite a long time in SAS and other preprocessor languages. But what makes custom properties different is that they're dynamic variables, and they can be updated in your CSS or with JavaScript. Preprocessor variables are compiled into regular CSS properties before your code hits the browser. The browser will never know what is and isn't a variable. But custom properties are computed in the browser, and that has implications for how we can use them. So let's first of all take a look at a simple use case, and that's repeating values, which is perhaps the most obvious use case for custom properties, anywhere you have a value that's repeated throughout your code. So for the most basic example, if we have an element that we want to be square, we would have to set the size in 2 places for the width and the height. But by setting a custom property, we just have one place to tweak that value if we want to make an update or if we want to change it within a media query or something like that. So here, this isn't related to custom properties, but I'm using the CSS min function, which is a relatively new addition to the CSS specification. The min function takes a list of comma-separated values, and the resulting value will be the smallest value of that list. So if if 40 rounds is smaller than 90 VW, viewport width units, then the value will be 40 rounds and no larger. So I really like using like min, max, and clamp. They're the new CSS functions that you can use in this way. So I just thought I'd drop that in there in case you're not aware of that one. So custom properties are pretty handy too for shorthand property values. So suppose you have two elements, you have different top padding values, but you have the same padding for the remaining sides. And then at different breakpoints, we need to adjust the padding on the three remaining sides identically across both elements. So that actually ends up being quite a lot of code to write. But we could replace those identical values with a custom property. And that way we only need to change one value within our media query. And that will update every instance of that variable where it's used. And we could do that for multiple breakpoints if we needed to. And we can even use it for partial values. So here I'm defining a variable called color, which actually sets the RGB values in our RGBA function inside a linear gradient. So we know that the red, green, and blue RGB values will be the same for both parts of our gradient, but we're just changing the alpha channel from 0.2 opacity to 1. So we just know that our gradient is going to use the same color. And it's pretty useful too for vendor prefixes, especially for long values. So clip path still needs to be prefixed in some browsers. Instead of having two places to set that clip path, if you have a really long polygon value with lots and lots of points, maybe if you want to make a change to that, then you have to remember to copy and paste that into two different places. But if we set that as a custom property instead, then we just have one place to make any changes. And that's going to be copied over to our prefix CSS property and the regular CSS property. So in the examples so far, I'm defining the custom property on the root element, making it a global variable. But you can also scope the custom property to a selector, and we'll look at some reasons to do that a little later on. But defining global variables can be a good idea if they're part of a design system. So if they're global values that we need to use repeatedly across different components in different places in our code base. It's becoming really popular for websites to have a dark theme, and using custom properties makes it quite easy to implement this. So this is how I do it on my own website. I have all my colors set as custom properties. And then I use the prefers color scheme media query to redefine those variables for dark mode. So prefers color scheme will basically detect your user's system preferences, whether they've indicated at a system level that they prefer dark mode, light mode, or if they don't have a preference, you can target them in those three different ways. And that's part of the level 5 media query specification. So again, it's relatively new. So I don't have to change all of my custom properties here because some of them, like the primary brand color and the header color, will actually remain the same, whether it's dark mode or light mode. I only have to change these 5 custom properties, and that's my dark mode implemented right across my site. The only thing is I do have to be a little bit careful about naming them. So my instinct is to name variables things like BG dark or BG light for the background color. But of course, when we switch those values for dark mode, you don't want a value for BG light that is actually a dark color. That would just be too confusing. So I kind of settled on a way that works for me because my website is very simple and it's only me maintaining it. But of course, if you're working in a big team and you have a much more complex site, then you probably want to give a bit more thought to your variable names than I have. So now we're going to do a bit of a demo. Just going to switch over to the browser. So here we are in Chrome. So we have these two call to action components. So we can do a similar thing basically for theming components and pages, a little bit like we did for dark mode. So we have these two call to actions, and at the moment they're just using a default red color scheme. So if I open up the CSS panel here, you can see the area where I'm defining all the colors for the call to action. We basically have those color values defined in 4 places here. If we were using SAS, then we'd probably set those as variables. We might nest some of the selectors, but the amount of code would be roughly the same. Now, if I want to theme one of these components with a blue color theme, I have all the CSS for that here. Basically, have to redefine all of those colors that are used. But we can make that much more concise with custom properties. So, first of all, what I'm going to do is set those custom properties on the root selector. So we're going to have 2 colors. We have a primary color. I'm just going to grab this one here. And a secondary color. So that's that one here. That's the sort of darker red, and the primary color is the brighter red. And then every instance of where I'm using these custom properties, I would just replace those in my code. So we have 2 places where we're using the secondary color, and then we have 2 places where we're using the primary color. I'm sure there's a much quicker way to do this, but I don't know what it is. Cool. So then for our blue color scheme, so right now if we apply our class of THBlue here, yeah, now we have our blue color scheme. So that's using all this code down the bottom here. What we can actually do is, well, we're going to delete that in a second. We actually need those color values. So we're going to set our custom properties for our blue theme on the selector here. So we'll grab our primary color, that's the light blue, and our secondary color, that's going to be this darker blue here. And then we can actually just delete all of this code. And that's our blue theme implemented any place we want to use it. So we could also add a green theme if we want to. So we'll just set the primary color as lime green, just use some CSS named colors. You probably won't do that in your actual code because it might look a bit horrible. And then the secondary color is just going to be green. So then instead we could apply our green theme. So there we go, we can implement those themes with just a couple of lines of code for each one. And obviously these are quite simple components. They only had like 4 places they were setting the colors, but you can imagine if you have much more complex components, you might be having to set those color values in lots and lots of places. And also if you have loads of themes that you're working with, that ends up being a lot of code, but custom properties make that way more concise. And the reason I'm using these selectors like with the th appended to them, I forget the word now, prepended with the th, is because so rather than having a component specific class like CTA green or CTA blue or whatever, I can actually apply this theme class anywhere. It doesn't have to be on this component. It could be another component, or it could be at the page level. And I could apply that theme everywhere. So I could add this THBlue class up here on the wrapper. And that will actually apply our blue theme to everything inside that wrapper. And then obviously I'm overriding it with this second CTA with the green theme, but if I remove that, then everything's going to be blue. So it just makes these classes really, really versatile. They can serve lots of purposes. So As I hope you can see, custom properties make implementing multiple color themes really straightforward. And it doesn't have to be just colors as well. It could be things like fonts as well. But the main drawback I find is browser support. So IE 11 doesn't support custom properties. And in most cases, when I'm dealing with older browsers, for things like grid, I'm happy to provide like a simpler layout as a fallback. It could use Flexbox, or it could be a single column layout, just so the website is usable. But with custom properties for theming, I find that things like brand colors and fonts and things like that are areas where the client doesn't really want to compromise. They want those colors to be seen in all browsers, even browsers like IE and older browsers. So I have been kind of reluctant to use custom properties in this particular way until quite recently, but there are a couple of polyfills available. So the first one here, post CSS Custom Properties, that actually only polyfills custom properties on the root element. So that's not very helpful for theming because, as you've seen, we need to be able to define custom properties on a class or another selector. But the second one here, IE 11 Custom Properties, does what we want it to do. And that's the one I've been using in recent projects. So that works pretty well. In the theming example, we're using a mixture of global and local scoping. So the initial variables are set on the root selector, which is probably appropriate if it's the default theme. And then alternative color scheme variables are set on a class. So they'll override the root variables because they have higher specificity. But another reason for global variables might be in order to maintain vertical rhythm and consistent spacing. So we could set a custom property for one vertical spacing unit. So we're going to call that vertical rhythm custom property VR and set its value as 2 rems. And these highlighted margins are each one VR unit, so 2 rems. And these spaces are 2 times our vertical spacing unit. So we can use calc for that. And we can implement this quite easily using the lobotomized OWL selector, which is a term coined by Hayden Pickering. That uses the adjacent sibling combinator. So here we're saying that any element that follows another element should have a standard top margin with a value of 1 VR, so 2 rems. But for some elements, we'll override this and give them a top margin of a multiple of a VR unit. So any H2 that follows another element will have a top margin of 2 times our vertical rhythm unit. And perhaps we want that space to scale at different breakpoints. So we give elements a bit more breathing room on larger screens by increasing the white space. So where we're setting that custom property, we could specify that at a certain breakpoint, we want to increase that VR unit across the whole site. So the large spaces will always be twice the width of the smaller ones, whatever our screen size, and you only need that one media query. We need to only update that one variable in a media query. You could, of course, have even more media queries if you wanted to. Now, for even more consistency, we could abstract that calc value into another custom property of its own. And we don't need to recalculate that 2VR variable in the media query because it's going to be automatically updated for us. It's calculated using the VR custom property that we're already updating. So you can have, a whole system of these if you want to do a sort of modular scale. You have 2VR, 3VR, 4VR, and use those wherever you want throughout your code. So we can calculate custom property values from other custom properties, which can be really useful. One example that's already been written and talked about quite a bit is color. So I really like using HSL when I'm working with custom properties, and that stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this one because it's already fairly widely documented, but setting variables for each of the values in HSL gives you a fine degree of control over color. So in this example, I'm using a custom property for the hue value. I'm setting the hue value as 3 degrees, so that corresponds to a red hue. And then I'm setting a second custom property, hue 2, which I'm calculating as the original hue plus 180 degrees. So that corresponds to a hue value from the opposite side of the color wheel, and that's going to give us a complementary color pair. So we could create a bunch of color pairings and adjust them as much as we want just by tweaking one value. The secondary color will always respond and be the exact same number of degrees from the first. We don't need to recalculate that secondary color every single time. So this is in fact a single div CSS illustration of a color wheel that I made for like no particular purpose. I could have just made this in Illustrator for this this presentation, but I thought, hey, why not make a thing in CSS as well? Because yay, CSS is fun. So it's made using only CSS gradients, so conic gradient in particular, and the mask image property. And it uses custom properties in a similar way to determine the hue value of each segment. So each segment is 30 degrees, which we can set as a custom property. And each gradient stop and each color is calculated as a multiple of that custom property. So the second segment, the orange segment, is the original segment value times 2. The third one is the original segment value times 3, and so on. We could set these as their own custom properties if we choose to. So what we're doing here is setting custom properties that are relative to one another. And that doesn't have to apply just to color like this. So I don't know if anyone has been watching the TV series His Dark Materials, which is on the BBC here in the UK. So I was watching this last year. The first series was on last December. And it has an amazing title sequence. And at the end, they show this kind of logo with this sort of bisecting slash down the middle of it. And I really liked the design of that. And I thought I would have a go at creating it with CSS. So it uses 2 clip paths. And with an overlay, you can see those clip paths a bit more easily. And the second clip path needs to be offset from the first by the same amount in 2 places to create that bisecting slice. So we have 2 x values in our clip path polygon points that are separated by the same amount at the top and at the bottom. Now, without custom properties, if I update one path, then every time I do that, I have to work out the revised path of the other revised path. So it starts to be a bit of a headache, but we could set some custom properties for those variables. So we're setting variables for the x-axis values of where we want to clip the elements at the top and at the bottom, and the offset value for the distance between the 2 paths. And then we can calculate the x value of the second path relative to the first, and have that update automatically whenever I adjust one of those x-axis values. So if we want to change the position of the clip path, or if we want to have a bigger gap between them, then all we need to do is change the custom property. We don't need to actually update the clip path property at all. Now, so far, we've talked a lot about using globally scoped custom properties, but in the last couple of examples, you might have noticed we're scoping them to a selector, and there are plenty of cases when that's more useful. So one reason you might want to do it is to avoid a naming clash, which might mean the selector inadvertently inherits a custom property that you've set on an ancestor. So personally, I find it helpful to set custom properties as close as possible to the point I'm using them. And setting a custom property on a selector means it's inherited by its descendants. There are also possible performance issues with using a lot of custom properties on the root element. Updating a custom property will cause a style recalculation of its descendants. So if you're using lots of custom properties and you're updating them frequently, you might get some performance issues there. So setting them only where you need to use them is kind of the preferable option. And one example is a layout class. So here we're setting a custom property called cols for the number of columns in the grid layout, and then updating it within the media query to avoid having to write out the entire grid template columns declaration again. The cols doesn't need to be a global variable because it only applies to our grid. And it means that if we have another layout class somewhere else in our code, then we're free to use that same custom property name. I like to use custom properties quite a lot with grid layout. And one reason is because I sometimes work with quite complex grids. I find that using custom properties can make them a bit more maintainable. And the other reason is they have a really similar level of browser support. So we can test for support using feature queries like this. So if the browser supports custom properties, the code inside this at support statement will be executed. And what we can do is we can put our fallback code for older browsers above this at support statement, and then allow the code inside the at support statement to override that if the browser does support it. And we have to do it that way around because IE doesn't support at supports. So we can't use like at supports not to query whether it doesn't support custom properties, because in IE 11 or other older browsers, that would just be completely ignored because the browser won't understand it. So yay, fun. Now, as I touched upon with colors, using calc with custom properties opens up a whole new world of excitement. So one place you can have a lot of fun with them is with staggered animations. So suppose we have a group of elements and we want them to animate in, but we want a slight delay between the start of each element's animation to create a staggered effect. We can use custom properties to achieve this. So first we assign each element a custom property that corresponds to the element's index. We don't need to assign the first one because we can use a default value, which, if you remember, it will fall back to if the variable isn't defined yet. And then we can use calc to calculate the delay between each one and assign it to its own custom property. And then we can use that in place of the animation delay value in the shorthand property. So if you're working with lists or any kind of UI where you have groups of similar elements that need to transition in, then using an element's index as a custom property can be really handy. So just to digress from the animation angle for a moment, we can use a similar technique to help visualize progress, which is something I did on a recent project. I needed to build a UI with a series of steps showing the customer journey. At the top of each step is a little progress bar to indicate the steps position relative to the total number of steps. So if you were at step 5 out of 10, that little progress bar would be 50% filled. So I gave each list item a custom property that corresponds to its index in the list. And the whole list has a custom property that corresponds to the length of the list, or the number of items. And in this case, I'm setting those in the HTML rather than in the CSS. And the advantage of that is if you're using a templating language, you can set the custom property within the loop. So if you're looping over items, you can use the loop index. I use Twig and Nunjux mostly, but most templating languages, if not all of them, will give you a way to do that. And of course, if you're using React or a JS framework, it's super easy to get that index value. So there are different ways you could style up that little progress bar, but the way I'm doing it is using a linear gradient background with hard color stops. So in the CSS, I calculated the gradient stop as a percentage using the length and item index custom properties. So this is step 2 out of 5. So that progress bar is 2/5 filled. So armed with a custom property value that matches the element's index, we can get even more creative, especially with text. So let's do another demo, yay. So we have some text here. If we take a look at the HTML, you can see I'm wrapping each letter in a span and assigning that a custom property that corresponds to the index. And then I'm assigning the whole H1 a custom property corresponding to the total number of characters, so 15. Now, there are accessibility implications with wrapping each letter in a span. Some browsers will not announce that as a whole word. They'll read out each letter individually. So you need to make sure you account for that. And you can use, there are different ways to do that. You could use aria label or aria labeled by, or a visually hidden element with the actual text in. So we could do like aria label and hello smashing. And then what you want to do is also hide these spans inside it, because you don't want a screen reader to read out hello smashing and then proceed to announce each letter individually. So you can set aria hidden on the actual elements as well. I'm not going to go through and do every single one of them, but hopefully you get the idea. So that's just one way you can deal with accessibility here. So now if we go down to the CSS, the first thing we're going to do is do something a bit more interesting with the color. So I'm going to use HSL for this. And I'm going to set a variable for the hue value, like you saw in the examples earlier. And then we can set saturation and lightness as 50%. And we can provide a default value for the hue, which we'll set as 0 degrees. Now, you probably won't notice much change now because our text was already red, and 0 degrees is going to be a red hue. But if I change that to 120 degrees, then you can see that's updated. So we know it's using the default value at the moment. Also, I've preset the span as display in block. And that's because we're going to do some animation in a moment. But every single time I practiced this demo, I wondered why my animation wasn't working. And it's because I was just using the span as an inline element. And I forgot to do that every single time. So I can provide. So now let's calculate a hue value based on the character index. So we're going to use character index, and we're going to multiply that by 30 degrees and see what happens. Cool, so we have lovely rainbow text because it's looping through the spectrum in 30-degree increments. Now, if we want to be even more clever about it, what we can do is make sure it only loops through the spectrum once. It doesn't keep sort of endlessly going, you know, cycling from red to yellow to green and all the way back to red and starting again. So I'm going to set another variable called deg, short for degrees, and I'm going to use the character total. I'm going to divide 360 degrees, so that's like the limit for the hue value because it's like a color wheel. It's 360 degrees. I divide that by the character total, and then I'm going to use that here. Cool, so now that's just going to loop through the spectrum once, no matter how long our text is. If we change that to be a larger number of characters or a smaller number, that's always going to go nicely from red all the way through to pink. So now we can do a bit of animation. And we're just going to set a super simple animation here. We're just going to do a transform. We're going to use translate Y. I'm just going to set that as 1 rem. And then we'll set that in here. So we want that to last 600 milliseconds. We want it to go on forever and ever. And we want it to go up and down. Cool. So it's all animating together at the moment. So what we're going to do next is add a delay variable. And we'll set a default as 0 milliseconds for that. And we'll calculate it up here, again, using the character index. And then we'll multiply it by 30 milliseconds. So now we have a little jumping kind of disco text worm. Hooray! So if you feel like setting custom properties on every single element could get a little laborious, there's a library called Splitting.js that does that work for you. And it's pretty much my favorite JS library for using in demos. So it provides you with a custom property for each character, like we saw there, the character index, and also a custom property for the length of the text string too. And you can split it into words and things as well. And it gives you actually a lot more control than just wrapping every letter in a span, although that is an option. So let's look at some examples for how we can use this. I really love playing around with CSS motion path. So the motion path specification enables us to place elements along on a path and to animate them along that path. Just a quick warning, there's quite a lot of motion in the next section. So if you're someone who suffers from motion sickness, you might want to skip over this part or at least proceed with caution. To use motion path, we need two properties. We need offset path to define the path itself, and offset distance to specify how far along the path to place an element. So for offset path, we get a path value similar to SVG path syntax. So that's how I get my paths. I draw them as SVGs and then copy the resulting value of the D attribute. An offset distance value of 0 would place an element at the start of the path. And then we can animate the offset distance property. So here I'm just moving it from the 0 position to 100%. So moving it from one end of the path to the other. So that's going to give us this little ball sliding up and down the curve. So it's a fairly simple animation, but kind of cool that we can do that just with CSS. Now, the name motion path is a little misleading as it doesn't have to necessarily just relate to motion. We can position stationary elements along the path if we choose to. So if we want to position several elements equidistantly along the path, then custom properties are great for that. So again, we are calculating the offset distance value of each element using the elements index as a custom property. And we can even do it with text. So this works best with uppercase text, a monospace font, or a font where each character has a very similar width. Otherwise, the spacing gets kind of weird. And if we want to get even more clever about it, we could use the same technique as in the rainbow text demo to ensure that our text is positioned along the full length of the path by calculating the offset as a variable based on the total number of elements. So just like that previous demo. And again, splitting JS is great for that. It provides us with those custom properties out of the box. So we could position our text around a circle using offset path, for instance. And we could, of course, position our text in a circle using transforms. But the difference here is the text remains selectable, which is pretty cool. So again, we're dividing the path length by the total number of characters plus 1 in this case, which is in case we want a space after our text ends. And that gives us the offset value for each character. Then we multiply that by the character index in our offset distance property. So even if we change the length of the text, it will still fit in that circle. So that's a static text example, but we can animate text along the path too. So here our keyframe animation is moving each character along 12 rams from its original position, which is calculated with the custom property. So that gives us this result. So that's okay, but not particularly exciting. But we could also add a small delay to each character using the same technique as the staggered animation before. And that gives our animation a much more fluid, organic feel, which I think feels a lot nicer. And of course, we can get even more creative with our paths and the properties we animate. But this demo is using exactly the same techniques as the previous one, and nothing more advanced than that. And this one's pretty similar, but with the addition of a 3D transform. But you can get pretty complex with custom properties if you want to and calculate a bunch of things. So in the following demo, I have these 12 custom properties, some of which are calculated from others. So this is one of the more complex demos. And those custom properties are computing the values for the delay, color, 3D transform rotation value, the position along the path using offset distance, and the animation duration of each of those individual segments. So there's really no limit to how creative you can get if you use your imagination and if you like doing maths, which apparently I do. We can also manipulate custom property values with JavaScript. So this is a tool I built for generating zigzag gradient backgrounds. So whenever the user moves one of these sliders, it changes one of the custom properties, which I'm using to set the thickness of the stripe, the angle, and the width of the zigzags. And although we can't use animations or transitions on CSS gradients, we actually can transition custom properties with Houdini, which allows us to do the same thing. So Houdini is a set of APIs that allow developers to extend CSS. And what we do is we register the property in JavaScript. So we need a name, which in this case, it's our angle custom property. The syntax, so because it's an angle, it uses degrees, so it's an angle. Whether it inherits, and we need to give it an initial value. That's really important, otherwise it won't work. And then we transition it just like any other CSS property. And that makes the whole thing feel a little bit smoother. So that's another bonus you get with using custom properties, although it's not supported in all browsers. So I'm also doing the same thing with the width of the stripes and the thickness too. I'm transitioning all of those gradients. Now, from Chrome 85, you can register the property in CSS instead and transition it in the same way. So we actually don't need any JavaScript at all. Be cool, yay. And just to show you a super quick demo, I'm not actually going to do any coding for this one. This is one I made a few weeks ago. I'm animating these gradient borders just with CSS. So I'm using the border image property, and you can see I'm registering these properties in CSS here. So the first one, the conic gradient, that's only transitioning the angle custom property. And then radial gradient one is doing something slightly different. We're actually transitioning the X and Y position of that radial gradient and doing those in keyframe animations. So you can see I'm setting those on the root element here. And then in my keyframes, I'm actually just transitioning those custom properties and nothing else. So we can also set custom properties in JavaScript. So this is a demo where every letter is animated in at random. So I'm looping over the characters and assigning each one a randomized custom property using this getRandom function. And then I'm using it just like the staggered animation examples that we've already seen, but so that the letters animate randomly rather than sequentially. So I hope this has given you a bit of a glimpse into custom properties. I'm really sorry if I've run over time. I feel like I have. And I hope it's left you feeling a little bit inspired to play around with them and build some fun things. If you'd like some more resources, there are loads and loads of articles and demos and things out there, so it was really hard to just pick a few. But Leah Veru recently wrote a guide to CSS variables that's pretty helpful for custom properties if you're just getting started with them. Una Kravitz has a great write-up of using color and theming with CSS custom properties. And my own blog, CSS in Real Life, has quite a lot of articles that relate to custom properties and some of the demos that I've showed you here today. So thank you very much for listening. You can also find me on Twitter. I'm Mish Barks, or I'm at CSS in Real Life if you just want the CSS stuff. So thank you very much.
Excellent, Michelle. Thank you so much, as always. This has been an incredible and huge amount of all kind of techniques and all. Wow, that was really inspiring. And I'm sure that very much like I believe it was Scott Regis who said that now I know where I'm going to spend my Christmas. This is going to be Michelle's code pen. And that's a good idea. I think it is a good idea. So I'm wondering, Michelle, it's been so interesting. It's when we look back and we look back at CSS specifically, you know, we used to make fun of CSS and how semi-broken that was, or how, you know, weird and confusing it was for a while, and all those things. And we came quite far when it comes to grid layout, when it comes to subgrid that's coming up soon as well, and then, you know, custom properties and all. So that's a tremendous kind of development, I guess, and change. And in many ways, the CSS changes so many things. I'm wondering though, do you feel like CSS is becoming so mature that at some point we just won't need Sass anymore? Because many things, maybe like nesting, maybe like, mixins and all, will just naturally dive in, becoming a part of CSS, or is it just a bit too far?
It's interesting because actually in a lot of my demos, I kind of almost challenge myself not to use Sass. Like partly because I want to make my demos kind of as accessible as possible. I don't want people to have to kind of depend on Sass to be able to understand them. But also just because I'm just interested to see, how far I can get without that, and at what point it starts to become annoying. So I kind of, so in production code, I still feel like we're some way off abandoning Sass completely. So Sass variables, so CSS variables, you can't set things like media query breakpoints in those, or like you can't use them for like part of your selector names. What I would really love is to be able to use the item index like as something that's just native to CSS rather than having to manually set it in the HTML. Right. And I think that there is kind of a proposal to do that, but it's nothing that's anywhere near being implemented at this point. I feel like there are some other gaps that Sass just makes our development experience so much better at the moment. So nesting is an interesting one because the thing is, obviously when you're nesting with Sass, that actually just all gets compiled into regular CSS. It's not nested when it's in the browser.
Right.
And I think that is a little bit of a concern that if you're nesting code in CSS, and that's actually going to be, if you're doing that too much or you're kind of using that, then that's actually going to be much more or much less performant for the browser to pass CSS if it's all nested like that. I don't know enough about that to be super clear on it, but I kind of feel like Sass does a good thing for us there at the moment. I don't know if we're ready to kind of leap into that yet, but I would I'd be willing to give it a try.
It's also very interesting that we all really come up with all kind of techniques, and so many techniques that you discovered, that you showed, just unbelievable. And you can really just go ahead and do that. And also the one that Suzanne came up with, custom properties stacks, right? I think you mentioned them, where the idea was really to rely on kind of very much like we do with font family, right? We have a couple of fonts, so you could have a couple of custom properties. If one is not defined, then you kind of move on to the next one, and then to the next one, then to the next one. And so just speaking about states and button color, brand color, and depending on what is defined in a particular scope, right, one of them will be applied or not. It's just mind-blowing. You can do that, and it really saves you a lot of trouble when you have to be too explicit when writing CSS. There were a couple of questions. Right, there were a couple of questions that came up specifically about the performance if you're defining too many custom properties and you have a lot of calc variation or calculation in place as well. Do you know anything about that impact, or is it negligible? I never saw any issues, any big trouble with that, to be honest.
Yeah, this is it. On the only places where I've kind of done, I haven't done all the kind of proper testing on that. The only places where I'm using tons and tons of custom properties in that way, on that kind of rainbow slinky demos you saw, is on CodePen, and that's not. I'm not saying anyone should implement that in production. I actually don't know how kind of relatively performant or not that would be. There are some people who have done quite intensive testing. So I think Lizzie Linnart is a developer who she's written a whole article and done a lot of testing with this situation with kind of a proper code base with custom properties versus not using custom properties. And there are other developers who've done that as well. I've read a couple of articles, but also that changes all the time as well, because browsers are kind of, I think, are prioritizing custom properties a bit more now. So they're actually, you test it 1 year and it will not have as much effect as, test, or not have the same effect as testing it a year later. So these things are changing all the time. But yeah, that's not something I'm really an expert in. But certainly, like probably if you're not updating them frequently, then I can't see that there would be a problem with setting a ton of variables on the root element, because you could basically treat it as your design tokens, right? Like they're kind of your just your global variables, like you be setting them in SAS. And if you don't have to update those, then it's probably not going to cause issues. But I'm not too much of an expert on that.
I totally agree with you on that as well, because the performance issue usually would come up in a case where you have layout invalidation, where something has to change. If you change the font size of everything with every resize, yes, that's probably going to be an issue. But then again, it happens once, because people usually don't just go ahead and resize all the time while accessing the site. So that might not be a big issue, but that will cause, of course, repaints that you need to be aware of. And if you have a lot of recalc, so if you have, let's say, custom properties that didn't kind of keep predefined, right, I guess, then it might be an issue. But I think I haven't really read any article which would say that this is horrible for performance. So, well, we could go forever, right? But maybe there is one more question that came up from Andre. And he said, well, you spoke about vertical written, right? Which was great, by the way. It was really, really cool and useful. You spoke about vertical written, and designers often pick font sizes according to a certain formula or scale. So if I define the font size of HTML as a custom property, can I compute other font sizes of a scale, like headlines and buttons and footnotes and things like that, by CSS calc to maintain a certain vertical written, maybe with a nested custom property in there?
So I'm actually experimenting with that at the moment. There is an article that I came across. I can't remember the name of the person who wrote it right now, but I'll try and dig it out again and share it. It's about exactly that thing. So I'm trying to rebuild my own personal site, and I'm trying to do as much as I can with custom properties, just as an experiment. And yeah, certainly you can implement a modular scale for typography that way. But I'm just kind of only beginning to explore that. But I feel like other people have maybe done a bit more.
Yeah, so it seems to me like one of those things. Once it gets out there and somebody writes a blog post about it, maybe it's going to be Michelle Barker. You never know. It's all of a sudden it just solves a problem, because I remember vividly how SAS would output massive CSS for font sizes of H1, H2, H3, H5, and everything in between as well, and then making up a really, really huge beast with typography CSS. So that maybe this time is about to fade away. Well, looking at the future.
Sorry, I was just gonna mention one more thing about font sizing. So this is something I'm finding with my website that I'm sort of trying to redesign now, is that so I quite like using the min, max, and clamp functions. So with clamp, you can have 3 values, and it's going to basically pick the middle one of the 3, depending on how you resize. So you basically can create proper responsive typography. But if you're using custom properties, then that kind of, well, in fact, using clamp kind of plays havoc a bit with your modular scale, because if you're using custom properties and you're using a modular scale, but you're also clamping the value, then actually you don't really have a modular typography system anyway if you're defining limits on that at either end.
Right, that makes sense.
It's not going to scale everywhere. I feel like, that's you kind of maybe need to pick one or the other, or you just need to be super clever about how you use them.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I guess it's something we'll have to figure out next year, maybe. Speaking of next year, by the way, Michelle, maybe that's the last question before we wrap up here. What is the one thing that really excites you? Is it CSS Houdini? Is it Subgrid? Is it something entirely different? What really excites you for next year?
So yeah, Houdini, I'm kind of starting to use and just play around with a lot more. I'm really excited about that. Subgrid, I've been excited about it for a while, but we really need to get it in more browsers. It's only in Firefox right now. And I think it would be a bit of a game changer for using CSS Grid. A lot of people still don't reuse it. And I think Subgrid is kind of the limitation of that, like because browsers don't implement that yet. So yeah, I am excited to get that, in Chrome and other browsers, but I don't know if that's going to happen. CSS logical properties are also really cool. I'm sort of starting to use those a bit more as well. And as I mentioned, like using min, max, and clamp, and seeing kind of what more can be done with them, and like pushing those a bit further.
Well, that sounds that sounds like a really great outline and topic for the talk you are going to give at Smashing Meets in December 2021, isn't it?
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like we are not going to go anywhere when it comes to CSS for sure. Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Michelle, for being with us. It was a wonderful, wonderful session.